Hello and welcome to Close Reading Classic Literature with me, Dr. Octavia Cox. In this lecture today, I will draw out some literary allusions in Jane Austen's early writing from her Juvenilia poem, her Juvenilia piece, Ode to Pity, written in 1793. So I'll draw out these allusions in order to show the ways in which Jane Austen poked fun at the literary conventions and cliches of that were popular at the time that she was writing, even from her own very early writing, very early in her career. I am going to analyse particularly the pastoral conventions and cliches of mid-18th century poetry, much of which would go on to inspire the sorrowful, gloomy, pitiful, melancholy imagery which dominated the popular Gothic fiction and novels of sensibility, so sentimental novels of the late 18th century, which Austen was also challenging in her writing. Poking fun at literary conventions was clearly something that Jane Austen loved to do in her writing, in her fiction, as well as in her letters. And throughout her work, Jane Austen subverts literary conventions and cliches from pervasive 18th century writing, and that's what I'm going to be unpicking in a bit more detail today. So, for example, in the characters of Marianne Dashwood in Sense and Sensibility and Catherine Morland in Northanger Abbey, Jane Austen pokes fun at the conventions of the heroine of sensibility and the kind of cliches of Gothic novels and sentimental fiction, both of which were prevalent and were perhaps one of the most sort of popular, in terms of consumption anyway, forms of writing in mid to late 18th century literature. And what I want to look at today is how Jane Austen also sort of draws on the same conventions or plays with the same conventions and imagery that Austen engages with later in characters such as Marianne Dashwood and Catherine Morland, how she does that in this early poem, Ode to Pity. Jane Austen's lively engagement with and mockery of literary cliches, one of the things I love most about her writing, is evident even from her early juvenilia. So, for example, in Love and Friendship, a kind of epistolary or an epistolary novel, but a sort of mock sentimental epistolary novel, which was written before Ode to Pity. It was written on the 13th of June 1790, and that's by Jane Austen's own dating. And the characters Laura and Sophia sort of comically faint, being because they are overcome with sentimentality. So this is from Laura to Marianne. It was too pathetic for the feelings of Sophia and myself. We fainted alternately on a sofa. Adieu, Laura. So Laura's and Sophia's alternate faintings on a sofa play on kind of, as I've said, the sentimental and kind of conventions of sensibility. And it also sort of engages with literature that was also playing with those conventions too. So it is both an admiring reference to Richard Brinsley Sheridan's marvellously funny farce, The Critic, in which he satirises theatrical conventions of kind of sensibility and sentimentality, and a kind of condemnation of fey, you might say, heroines such as Samuel Richardson's Pamela Andrews from that epistolary novel Pamela from 1740, which was incredibly dominant, incredibly kind of popular, incredibly important text in terms of defining all sorts of aspects of the novel genre and what a heroine should be. So Richard Brinsley Sheridan's The Critic, or A Tragedy Rehearsed, which was first performed in 1779, has a stage direction in Act 3, Scene 1, in which a mother, son, and the figure of justice faint alternately in each other's arms. So you can see that Austen is kind of drawing on that earlier criticism in her own criticism. of conventions. But also, so Samuel Richardson's novel Pamela, as I said, published 1740, and which Austen clearly read, Pamela can hardly kind of move for fainting. So in letter 15, for example, she fainted away again. And that's in the text itself, the again. She fainted away again. So today I'm going to analyse another piece of Austen's Juvenilia, her poem, as I've said, entitled Ode to Pity, to examine how she plays with these same or very similar popular tropes from the literature of her youth that was popular when she was kind of young and first kind of first consuming literature, and all the conventions and all the cliches that she encountered that she wanted to kind of rail against and criticise, and sometimes fondly and sometimes critically. So Jane Austen was born in December 1775, and Ode to Pity was written in June 1793, when Jane Austen was 17 years old. So we can see that from her very early in her writing career, she enjoyed puncturing literary commonplaces. So first I'm going to read through the poem, and then I'm going to unpick and analyse it in more detail. To Miss Austen, the following Ode to Pity is dedicated from a thorough knowledge of her pitiful nature by her obedient, humble servant, the author. Ode to Pity. Ever musing I delight to tread the paths of honour and the myrtle grove, whilst the pale moon her beams doth shed on disappointed love, while Philomel on airy hawthorn bush sings sweet and melancholy, and the thrush converses with the dove. Gently brawling down the turnpike road, sweetly noisy falls the silent stream. The moon emerges from behind a cloud and darts upon the myrtle grove her beam. Ah, then what lovely scenes appear! The hut, the cot, the grot, and chapel queer, and eke the abbey too, a mouldering heap, concealed by aged pines her head doth rear, and quite invisible doth take a peep. End of the first volume, June the 3rd, 1793. And now to go through the poem. To start with the dedication. To Miss Austen, that is Jane Austen's elder, beloved sister Cassandra, the following Ode to Pity is dedicated from a thorough knowledge of her pitiful nature. So pitiful here meaning full of pity for others, so her sense of melancholy, her compassion, her tenderness, her sensibility. By her obedient, humble servant, the author. What is the tone here? The kind of, we might note the mock solemnity of the dedication. So Jane Austen's Ode to Pity is dedicated to Cassandra, as I've said, and her pitiful nature. We can see from Samuel Johnson's Dictionary of the English Language from 1755 that the word pitiful in the 18th century had two antithetical meanings, so oppositional meanings. Pitiful derives, as you might expect, from pity and full of pity. So on the one hand, you have a definition which is melancholy, moving compassion, tender, compassionate. But also you have the meaning paltry, contemptible, despicable. And these oppositional meanings, so pitiful being both kind of compassion provoking, pity provoking, and paltry and contemptible, so risible, laughable, condemnable, is evident in Jane Austen's pun in her use of the word pitiful in the dedication. So Austen puns on the kind of contemporary vogue for literature containing descriptions of nature designed to evoke, provoke, excite feelings of pity and tenderness. But simultaneously, how pitiful, how trifling, how laughable and contemptible she finds such descriptions of nature. Let's see how this duality plays out within the poem itself. So, taking the title, Ode to Pity. The title itself was not uncommon in mid-18th century poetry. The popular poets William Collins and Joseph Warton, for instance, both wrote an ode to pity, as did lesser-known 18th century poets such as Robert Fergusson and George Dyer. In her poem, Ode to Pity, Jane Austen draws fairly clearly on William Collins's incredibly popular poem in the 18th century, Ode to Pity, and that's from 1746. And when I say popular, that's you can see that from how often it was reprinted in miscellanies and anthologies and other texts, not necessarily from William Collins's own volumes. We might also just note while we're here the name, Mr. William Collins. Are there any inferences to be drawn from this name in relation to Pride and Prejudice and the Mr. William Collins there? But that's a subject for another day, but something to think about if you're interested. In Ode to Pity, Jane Austen also alludes to Joseph Warton's very, very well-known poem in the 18th century called Ode to Fancy, which is also from 1746. And just as a bit of an aside about Joseph Warton and Jane Austen was a particular fan of Joseph Warton's writing. So Joseph Warton, incidentally, was, like Jane Austen herself, buried in Winchester Cathedral. And their gravestones, if you've ever visited, their gravestones within Winchester Cathedral are actually adjacent to each other. So we know that Jane Austen appreciated Joseph Warton's poetry from her and his literary criticism. He was a great literary critic as well as a poet. And we know that Jane Austen was a fan of his from her nephew's poem, and this is her nephew James Edward Austen Leigh, who would go on to produce the infamous memoir of Jane Austen, dated from 1870. So this poem, written in memory of his very recently deceased aunt, includes the line, "The Warton whom she loved." The Warton whom she loved. High praise for Austen. She loved Warton. And we know that it's Joseph Warton rather than his brother Thomas Warton, who was also a popular writer at the time. We know it's Joseph because it occurs in connection with other notable persons besides Austen who are buried in Winchester Cathedral. And the poem is inscribed, Edward Austen on the death of his aunt, Miss Austen, the author, dated Sunday, September the 28th, 1817. Also, Jane Austen may well have encountered Joseph Warton personally. He was a prominent personage, so kind of not quite celebrity, but figure in the Hampshire of Jane Austen's youth, and was a clergyman as well as many other things, as well as being a writer and so on, in the same diocese as George Austen, as Jane Austen's father. And incidentally, in the 1740s, Warton had been the curate of Chawton, which was the village that Jane Austen and Mrs. Austen and Cassandra Austen would relocate to in 1809. But returning to Jane Austen's Ode to Pity, what is the overall irony of this Ode to Pity? Well, there is no actual pity mentioned in the main body of the poem at all. The poem is instead a more generalised kind of compilation of cliched sentimentalisms, which Austen kind of joyfully and affectionately, it seems to me, takes aim at and pokes fun at. Getting then to the main body of the poem, the opening couplet, ever musing, I delight to tread the paths of honour and the myrtle grove. So ever musing sort of suggests that the speaker, the narrative voice, is stuck in this poetic vein and kind of cannot escape it. Ever replies repetitiveness, so ever musing, that it continues always in this vein. You can't escape it. It's kind of musing, sense of kind of being in a state of abstract thinking, ever musing. Samuel Johnson, in his Dictionary of the English Language, defined to muse as to be absent of mind. So it's a kind of unrational, unreasoned thinking, ever musing. So kind of ever being in this poetical flight of fancy. So ever musing, I delight to tread the paths of honour. What are paths of honour? Well, possibly this is drawing on Thomas Gray's another incredibly popular mid-18th century poem, Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard from 1751. And in that poem, Gray writes, the paths of glory, very famous line, the paths of glory lead but to the grave. That's line 36. But it might possibly also be drawing on Mark Akenside's another incredibly well-known 18th century poem, The Pleasures of Imagination from 1744, where God asserts Akenside, to deck the honoured paths of just and good has added bright imagination's rays. So the honoured paths are justice and goodness, and on top of that we have imagination's rays, and that's the kind of point of imagination and poetry and so on. So ever musing on this thought, perhaps, is the speaker of Jane Austen's poem. So paths of honour really, by the time that Austen was writing, had become a kind of stock phrase or stock image. But what does it really mean, actually? What are the paths of honour? Perhaps the implication is that the speaker is saying, I delight to tread in the paths of literary convention. Myrtle Grove, the Myrtle Grove. Again, essentially by the time that Austen was writing Ode to Pity, another stock phrase. Myrtle, according to Samuel Johnson in the Dictionary of the English Language, 1755, defines myrtle as a fragrant tree sacred to Venus. Venus, in Roman mythology, I'm sure I don't have to tell you, but was the goddess of love, of beauty, of fertility, essentially the goddess of kind of womanhood, or a certain kind of femininity, or essential femininity. And Joseph so it has this kind of associations with the feminine. Joseph Warton, in Ode to Pity, in an apostrophe to Ode to Fancy, in an apostrophe to Fancy. And fancy is here kind of conceived as a sort of woman goddess figure. So Joseph Warton describes the nymph with loosely flowing hair, with buskined leg and bosom bare, thy waist with myrtle girdle bound. So she's kind of enveloped in myrtle. So again, we've got this idea of fancy, this idea of imagination from Akenside. Austen's Myrtle Grove might also possibly be a reference again to Collins's Ode to Pity. In that poem, Collins writes, amidst my native plains, been soothed by pity's lute, where first the wren thy myrtle shed on gentlest Otway's infant head. So Otway refers to the 17th century writer Thomas Otway. So apparently wrens, according to William Collins, have been shedding myrtle on those who write about melancholy or write in a kind of melancholic vein, a melancholy tone, for over a century. So in having this kind of imagery of pity, this woman pity, shedding myrtle onto Otway's head, we've got this idea of pity being associated with a kind of femininity and having, this sort of series of male, usually writers coming to describe ideal femininity through the lens of, or through the kind of character of pity. Moving on to the next few lines. Whilst the pale moon her beams doth shed on disappointed love. This is conventional imagery, conventional theme for an ode to pity, disappointed love. While Philomel on airy hawthorn bush sings sweet and melancholy. Philomel is a figure from Greek mythology. Philomela is the kind of poetic, literary name for a nightingale. And Philomela's story is famously described in the Roman poet Ovid's Metamorphosis. Symbolically, Philomela, after being raped and sort of exacting her revenge, is transformed into a nightingale, a bird renowned for its song. So she can sing of her sort of sorrow, lament, and sort of have this melancholy sounding song forevermore. To write Philomel sings sweet and melancholy is total poetic cliche, including the often used and indeed celebrated paradox of sweet melancholy, which sort of does encapsulate very much this mid-18th century style of poetry. They would come to be, so Elegy in a Country Churchyard by Thomas Gray and that whole sort of raft of mid-18th century poets would come to be known as the graveyard poets. And part of what groups them all together, you might say, is this kind of enjoyment, or at least it seems to be an enjoyment in their writing, of sweet melancholy. And this filters down into later poets too, so romantic period poets of Jane Austen's generation, in terms of being part of Romanticism as opposed to mid-18th century writing. Many of them seem to enjoy that paradox too, which you can see also in the enjoyment in the melancholy tone of Gothic literature and literature of sensibility as well. Keats, for example, John Keats is a poet who really sort of enjoys those paradoxes of sweet melancholy and enjoying that sense of pain. Really, this sort of idea that grew in the 18th century, that the truly sensitive soul kind of enjoys being in a state of melancholy. And to some extent, you might say that you can see that Marianne Dashwood in Sense and Sensibility Austen is playing on that kind of convention, that literary convention, to the idea that, pain is necessary to a sensitive soul. That you've got to find melancholy sweet, or at least that was kind of promoted by literature such as kind of sentimental, pastoral literature, such as she's exploring in Ode to Pity, or kind of alluding to in Ode to Pity. Coming to the concluding lines of the first stanza, and the thrush converses with the dove. Earlier I quoted lines from Collins's Ode to Pity, where first the wren thy myrtles shed on gentlest Otway's infant head. So the wren is a small songbird, and Austen might well have been amused by such comic bird imagery. Comic, at least to some, that a wren, this kind of small bird, could participate in a writer's being crowned with myrtle. And this kind of comic bird imagery makes me think of the Disney films, if you've ever seen them, where the kind of princesses are sort of dressed by birds in the forest. Similar, you might say, a similarly comic kind of version of an ideal pastoral. That here the wren is crowning this infant writer with myrtle. So Austen picks up on such kind of conventional pastoral poetry, bird imagery, and makes a kind of rather absurd in its nonsensicalness in her own lines, which close the first stanza, and the thrush converses with the dove. Does it? What does it say? There is no context to this imagery at all within the poem, just and the thrush converses with the dove. It's so vague as to be virtually meaningless. So the impression is of using an apparently poetical image, using apparently poetical imagery over conveying meaning. And it seems that that's Austen's criticism of the kind of writing that she is parodying and mocking here. In other words, that such poetry is style over real substance. A certain kind of style, not real style, not real good writing, but a certain kind of surface style. Symbolically, the thrush can symbolise hope and the dove can symbolise peace. So this image that the thrush converses with the dove might symbolise that even in this melancholy scene with the nightingale singing melancholy, sweet melancholy, hope and peace converse with each other. But it seems to me that Austen is joking that poems that rely on such kind of generalised stock imagery, however kind of poetical it may seem at a first glance, do not say anything new or anything really worth listening to. Rather than painting by numbers, this is poetry by platitudes and cliches. And then we move on to the second stanza, the opening couplet, the opening lines of the second stanza. Gently brawling down the turnpike road, sweetly noisy falls the silent stream. So the silent stream is a kind of pastoral trope, very, very common. It could perhaps be a reference to Collins's Ode to Pity, another reference. Wherefore need I wander wide to old Ilyssus? So Ilyssus is a Greek river. To old Ilyssus's distant side, deserted stream and mute. Collins's image of a stream as deserted and mute kind of contrasts with the busyness invoked by Austen in her use of turnpike road. So the stream is running down the road, and obviously a road is a much more sort of prosaic place for a stream to be. Austen's sweetly noisy, furthermore, might be a kind of ironic inverted echo of the tone, the kind of sound that Collins describes in his poem, which is of soft notes unspoiled by art. So that's the kind of sound that's going on in Collins's poem, whereas Austen's is sweetly noisy. She's got the busy turnpike road being, with this kind of water running down it, being apparently sweetly noisy. Is a busy road sweetly noisy? I think anyone who's ever lived near a busy road will tell you probably not. Their first thought is sweetly noisy. In the couplet, Jane Austen ironically highlights the preposterousness of some poetry's imagery. So in sweetly noisy falls the silent stream, she mocks that nonsensicalness. How can a stream be both noisy and silent? She uses a similarly kind of oxymoronical image in juxtaposing gently and brawling. To brawl, according to Samuel Johnson in his dictionary, means to quarrel noisily and indecently. Some imagery and diction here might be seeping in from William Shakespeare's As You Like It, where a character lies under an oak whose antique root peeps out upon the brook that brawls along this wood. Here, as in Austen's final image in the poem, which we'll get to, we have nature peeping out. Shakespeare's image, however, does not have the kind of paradoxical silence joked about by Austen. The couplet also has a comical juxtaposition in describing the pastoral imagery of a sweet stream, so a kind of a babbling brook or a murmuring brook that you might encounter in kind of conventional pastoral poetry and writing. So we have that conventional imagery and the kind of prosaically practical image of a turnpike road. A turnpike road required a toll charge in order to use it. It was a kind of practical thoroughfare, busy thoroughfare. Austen had made business was conducted kind of on it if you needed to go somewhere speedily. So Austen made a kind of similar joke, similar juxtaposition, you might say oxymoron, in terms of the imagery in Love and Friendship, written, as I said earlier, in 1790, in a similar scene in terms of Jane Austen parodying and undermining pastoral cliché. So in Love and Friendship, this is from letter the 13th, again it's Laura to Marianne. After having walked about 1.5 miles, we sat down by the side of a clear, limpid stream to refresh our exhausted limbs. The place was suited to meditation. A grove of full-grown elms sheltered us from the east, a bed of full-grown nettles from the west. Before us ran the murmuring brook, and behind us ran the turnpike road. We were in a mood for contemplation and in a disposition to enjoy so beautiful a spot. Nettles by a turnpike road. It's not really what you would usually think of as being a beautiful spot. And then the moon emerges from behind a cloud and darts upon the myrtle grove her beam. So we've got a repetition of moon imagery, and this will be important later in the stanza, which I will get to, where you compare the moon of the first stanza and the moon of the second stanza. But we also have a repetition of the phrase myrtle grove. As I said earlier, the image of myrtle was very, very commonplace in 18th century pastoral poetry. In her short poem, Jane Austen twice repeats the phrase myrtle grove, kind of lampooning the repetitiveness and lack of invention of such, within much poetic imagery of the kind of graveyard poets that I was talking about earlier, them and their followers, their imitators. So as I said earlier, Collins had used myrtles shed in his own ode to poetry, but by the end of the 18th century, the image had become a total commonplace and cliché. And we can see this even in the mid-18th century from Robert Dodsley's Miscellany, a collection of poems in 6 volumes by several hands, and this is the 1758 edition. This is the collection, the edition which Jane Austen herself possessed, and we know this because she had to sell her copy of Dodsley's poems in May 1801 when the family were relocating from Steventon to Bath upon the retirement of her father, George Austen. So in a letter to Cassandra Austen on the 21st of May 1801, Jane Austen was pleased to have received 10 shillings for Dodsley's poems, and incidentally that edition of Dodsley's poems also includes Joseph Warton's Ode to Fancy. So in that collection of poems, Dodsley's poems, imagery of myrtle appears at least 26 times, including, for example, George Littleton's image in To My Lord blank of fragrant groves of myrtle. This is just totally kind of standard, totally conventional, totally stock, totally repetitive, Austen is suggesting. So we might also note Austen's kind of use of a kind of comically poetic sentence structure in the odd ordering of the line. And darts upon the myrtle grove her beam. The moon darts upon the myrtle grove her beam. Only in poetry would such phrasing be used. In normal speech, in kind of everyday language, one would say instead, and darts her beam upon the myrtle grove. This sort of odd poetic ordering is often kind of used in 18th century poetry. It seems with the idea that somehow phrasing it in this sort of convoluted way, and darts upon the myrtle grove her beam, makes what you're saying more poetic. And lots of later writers, including writers like William Wordsworth, romantic writers, got frustrated with this just putting words out of a sensible order and assuming that therefore that makes it somehow more poetic, that it doesn't actually, that you should use kind of everyday ordinary language as people use it in their speech, and then if it is poetic, it will be poetic because of the thought or the imagery or the description or whatever, not just because you've put it in a roundabout order. Ah, then, what lovely scenes appear, the hut, the cot, the grot, and chapel queer. Again, we have paradoxical imagery. How can the scene be both lovely and queer? Queer in the older sense of the word, and this is from the Oxford English Dictionary. Queer here meaning strange, odd, peculiar, eccentric, of questionable character, suspicious, dubious. So Austen ironically refers to the lovely scenes of the hut, the cot, the grot. These are lovely scenes in poetical terms rather than necessarily in practical terms, something that Eleanor Dashwood considers in Sense and Sensibility when she hears what Robert Ferrers's idea of a cottage actually is. Austen shortens cottage to cot and grotto to grot in order to create half-rhyme monosyllables with the blunt alliteration of repeated T sounds, which kind of amusingly suggests hourly they are too squashed and overcrowded. So the hut, the cot, the grot. The drum-like almost rhythm creates an impression of monotonous kind of recurrence. And this is Austen, it seems to me, joshing writers such as Joseph Warton, who had piled images of ruins precariously on top of one another. And again, so this is what I mean by kind of lovely scenes, and them not really being kind of they're poetically lovely scenes, but not practically lovely scenes, because you wouldn't actually like to have to live in a ruined cottage, for example. But getting back to this idea of images kind of piled up on top of each other, which Austen, it seems to me, is mocking. In Ode to Fancy, for example, Joseph Warton had written, "Let us with silent footsteps go to charnels and the house of woe, to Gothic churches, vaults and tombs." It's kind of lists that lots of these poems have. And eke, the abbey too, a mouldering heap. So eke, and we've got those sort of internal assonance of the E sound, eke and heap. But eke is another deliberate joke about bad writing. Samuel Johnson in the dictionary observes of the transitive verb to eke, to spin out by useless additions. In this sense, it seems borrowed from the use of our old poets who put eke into their lines when they wanted a syllable. Absolutely bad writing then. And eke, the abbey too, a mouldering heap. So you've got and you've got eke. These are unnecessary expletives in the language of 18th century poetry. So an expletive is an unnecessary word of padding that you put into a sentence. And eke is one of the words that might be used to pad out a line. And eke, the abbey too, a mouldering heap. So we kind of know that we're in a world of antique poeticisms in the use of the word eke. So Mouldering Abbey is also a staple of Gothic fiction in the 1790s and is clearly, for example, what Catherine Morland expects of Northanger Abbey. She contemplates her upcoming visit there and the abbey's long, dark passages, its narrow cells and ruined chapel. Catherine Morland's expectations are derived from her reading, as well as Gothic novels. Perhaps she might have been reading some of this pastoral graveyard poetry of the mid-18th century. So not only in Gothic novels were mouldering abbeys par for the course, but they permeate 18th century, mid-18th century pastoral poetry too. Joseph Warton in Ode on Fancy had written that to some abbey's mouldering towers the melancholy person creeps. So the melancholy person kind of seeks refuge in an abbey's mouldering towers. And Austen kind of undercuts this image by rendering it as the abbey too a mouldering heap. Heap being, you could say, kind of humorously pathetic compared to towers. So you've got Warton's towers, the abbey's mouldering towers, and in Austen you have a mouldering heap. But we might also see this perhaps as a reference to Thomas Gray's elegy written in a country churchyard, which uses the exact phrase mouldering heap. So in that poem, from yonder ivy-mantled tower. So an ivy-mantled tower means that the ivy has mantled the tower, it's covered it, it's clothed it, it's covered, it's overgrown. It is, in other words, a ruined tower. The moping owl does to the moon complain of such as wandering near her secret bower molest her ancient solitary reign. Beneath those rugged elms, the yew tree's shade, where heaves the turf in many a mouldering heap. So Austen has taken that image of earth, the turf in many a mouldering heap, and sort of transplanted it to contrast it with an abbey's towers. And now we come to the closing couplet. Concealed by aged pines, her head doth rear, and quite invisible doth take a peep. This is comically antique language. Even in Jane Austen's time, doth was comically antique. And this is sort of similar to what William Wordsworth would later dismissively refer to as poetic diction. And what Wordsworth means when he talks about poetic diction is that which is kind of self-consciously poetic writing. And we can see that in the kind of repetition of doth, words such as doth. Picking up, for example, the doth of line 3, the pale moon, her beams doth shed. It's kind of deliberately antique, poetical. The ordering of the sentence is also comically poetic. So in the passive, her head doth rear, similar to what I was talking about earlier about word ordering, rather than the more straightforward description, she reared her head, which might be more usual in kind of everyday language. Aged pines had been kind of used as a pathetic, meaning pathos-inducing image in literature for much of the 18th century. In Alexander Pope's Eloisa to Abelard, for example, from 1717, this is where a young nun, Eloisa, laments her fate, having loved and lost the deserting Abelard. Eloisa describes the darksome pines that over yon rocks reclined, wave high and murmur to the hollow wind. And interestingly, later in that poem, in Eloisa to Abelard, Pope had also used the imagery of mouldering buildings to convey a sense of melancholy. So in Eloisa to Abelard, where round some mouldering tower pale ivy creeps, and low-browed rocks hang nodding over the deeps. So in poetry, kind of again and again and again in the 18th century, in the early to mid 18th century, this imagery, the same kind of stock phrases, or at least by the time you get to the end of the 18th century, they have become stock phrases and stock imagery, including things like aged pines. There is also, I think, an ironic reversal of kind of usual description in the imagery of the peeping moon. The moon doth quite invisible, doth take a peep. And this is especially, I think, compared to the pale moon of the first stanza, which was more passive. I think the imagery was more passive in the first stanza. So in the first stanza, we'd had the pale moon her beams doth shed on disappointed love. But here we have a peeping moon who's more active, I think, or at least there's a kind of implied that the moon is a bit more active than the very pale description, pale moon. What does it say really? The pale moon her beams doth shed on disappointed love. The moon isn't sort of participating particularly. It's just a pale moon and a kind of pale image, a pale piece of writing. Samuel Johnson in his dictionary defines a peep as a sly look. So a look that has something furtive, that has something artful, that has something cunning perhaps about it, something sly about it. So the moon in pastoral imagery, kind of conventional, standard, traditional pastoral imagery, is often described as solitary and alone, kind of removed and indeed above the earth's cares, the world's everyday cares, the kind of mundanities of life, that the moon is just sort of above it all, beautiful but cold and distant and removed and abstract, detached. Take, for instance, John Keats's beautiful poem Bright Star, that was written in 1819, in which he describes the moon as steadfast in lone splendour hung aloft the night. So in lone splendour hung aloft the night, and it's kind of removed and it's described as kind of distantly, patiently, detachedly watching the waves go in and out, the tide go in and out on the earth. But kind of unlike such majestic but detached imagery, Jane Austen's moon in stanza 2 almost kind of nosily takes a peep at the world below, even while keeping out of sight herself. She remains quite invisible as she peeps over the aged pines, almost like a nosy neighbour peeping over the garden hedge. And furthermore, the moon keeps kind of deliberately concealed, it seems. Concealed by aged pines, her head doth rear. So we might interpret this as, because she is concealed, she rears her head in order to take a better peep, because she is sure that she is quite invisible. The moon here is cast almost as a kind of prying eavesdropper over the brawling lives of those on the turnpike road. Even the moon in Austen's writing cannot escape becoming embroiled in the mundanities of everyday life in this second stanza. And it seems that Austen is suggesting, in the movement from the first stanza to the second stanza, and the pale, dull moon of the first stanza, and this potentially more interesting, even if nosy neighbour moon in the second stanza, that Austen is suggesting that she wants something more sly, more cunning, more sort of human and interesting in her descriptions, in her writing. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Remember, if you like what I do here on my channel where I analyse classic literature, then do subscribe. And if you have liked the video, then do please press the thumbs up button. It helps me out in YouTube's algorithm. Thank you to everybody who has supported my channel. Your support really is appreciated. And what do you think of Jane Austen's poem, Ode to Pity? What interpretations have you made, and can you find any other literary allusions that you think Jane Austen is making in the poem?